Education panel, that's what we're going to talk about. It's traditionally been, a really hard industry to disrupt, but two companies have done a really good job of that. So because we miss her and she's so well dressed today, we're going to bring back Leena Rao, and she is going to talk about hacking the classroom with Joel Klein from Amplify and Max Ventilla from AltSchool. Please welcome them.
Thank you both for being here. It's super exciting to see, two people who have done a lot. Max, you're new to this space, but Joel, you've been an innovator. Max, you're innovating right now. My first question is why does it seem that change in education is so glacial? Why is that specific field? You'd think it would be an area where we'd be open to disruption, but it seems like there's so much resistance.
It's really profound. I was saying to Max backstage, the thing that drove me nuts when I was running the schools in New York is just what you're focusing on, how resistant. And I think the reason is there's no incentive to change. Excellence is not rewarded. New and innovative ideas are not rewarded. And people get into a rut. You have a system that's based on lifetime tenure. They finally figure out what their winning formula is, and then they don't want to change it. And how you change the K-12 system is really a profoundly important question. Because of things like what Max is doing, some of the things we did in New York with School of One and others, you're beginning to see new models, new classroom approaches, new ways to think about. And I think this will accelerate over the next handful of years. Certainly the kind of thing we're doing at Amplify is designed to provide teachers the tools and the supports and the other things that'll help kids get better engaged. But school systems are going to have to want to experiment, and that's the big hope.
I'd very much agree. I think also systemically, schools aren't set up to change. And there are two things in particular that we see. One is right now with the model of education that we have, it's quite easy to mess up. You have one teacher in a room by themselves with a bunch of kids with the door closed. If they're just kind of winging it and going off and trying out different stuff, you can lose, 6 months, 12 months of time that a child could otherwise be learning much better. And so we're I think, rightfully cautious in the current model that we have. And a lot of what we look at AltSchool is how can we create a model which can course correct much faster, that can see when something has been introduced that's not a great change. And because we have that resilience, we are much more able to actually allow teachers to act with superior discretion, to allow parents and students to introduce kind of variance that suits them best. And then the other thing I would look at is, we have a really complicated system in education where you can't just switch out a teacher or change the calendar or do this. It's all interconnected. And so what you find is that if you just tweak one piece of it, you can actually end up worse off than you were before, even if it's very sensible that individual change that you made. And so I think for both those reasons, as well as for what Joel said, that the motivations just aren't there, the culture, the incentives just aren't there to push for change. It's not that surprising that we end up with something that looks very similar to how it looked 30, 50 years ago in a world where that doesn't describe anything else.
If you think about government generally, government is not the place you look for innovation,
no.
Right? So, and it's in part what Max just said, it's the big players, it's the bureaucrats, it's the politicians, it's the unions who are jockeying for advantage. And it's not driven by the kind of consumer, or in this case, student-driven, provider-driven model. And how you disrupt that is the great challenge.
Well, you make a good point because, AltSchool is a private institution, funded by venture capitalists. You guys are Amplify is part of News Corp. When is there going to be the public school systems, the governments that are going to be leading that innovation, or is that just never going to happen?
No, it'll happen. We did it in New York. We created a thing called the I-Zone, the innovation zone. And in fact, the model that, again, has similarities and differences from what Max is doing called the School of One, which became a very different approach. But we did it as a kind of innovation zone in a bureaucratic world. You know, it was like I used to say, why do we need a zone? Why isn't a whole school system innovating, driving, thinking new ways? But we did get some 200 schools to participate, incentivized a lot of new learning forms. Some of the first instances of blended learning all came through that process. Now other school districts come all the time to New York to try to replicate it. So it'll happen. And the other thing I've always said is there's nothing inherently good or bad about technology. I used to go to schools all over the city, and people used to show me their computers locked in a box. Because computers in and of themselves, tablets, are agnostic when it comes to teaching and learning. The question is, will teachers get the tools, the supports, the mid-course corrections? Will kids find the experience more engaging? Will we get them the higher order knowledge, the critical thinking that we need to do? Those are the critical questions. And if it just remains about gizmos and gadgets and technology, nothing's going to change.
Do you agree?
I certainly agree that technology is not any kind of a panacea. And one of the things that we believe very strongly, being a bunch of technologists working with educators in this space, is the most important technologies are actually invisible in the classroom. And technology doesn't mean a screen that you put a child in front of and then kind of walk away and say, you know, the role for a teacher is diminished. If anything, we see the role for a teacher increased in complement to the tools that allow them to do things very differently than they did before. So for example, to collaborate with other teachers in a very meaningful way, where they're building on the work product that someone else has made, where they are complementing each other in the moment for what the plan is for that particular child and what projects and activities are going to make up the week for that particular child. The ability of teachers to manage 20 different trajectories for the 20 different kids in their class, that's impossible to do without technology in any kind of a transparent, cost-effective way. But those kind of tools that let teachers collaborate, that let them really individualize at the level of different interests, at the level of different kind of optimal learning modes for every single child in their class, you wouldn't see that walking into an alt-school classroom. And so I think we have to think of technology much more broadly than an iPad. It's kind of a pet peeve of ours when we talk to educators and ask them about their technology approach, and they say, you know, we have an iPad for every student. That plays an absolutely transformative role if used in the right way, but it's a narrow slice of kind of what technology can and needs to do in an education context.
It's a good point, and you guys actually created your own tablet. And tell me the reasoning behind why Amplify did that.
Because I think everything we do at Amplify is viewed through the intersection of teaching and learning. I'm not a consumer guy. I'm really trying. So I wanted to optimize the hardware for the user experience. It's not about the hardware. I mean, in fact, we ruggedized the hardware in a partnership we created with Intel. But we did that because kids, again, use the tablet in a different way from adults. But what's really important is what's on the tablet. What Max just said is so important. I just give you two examples from our curriculum, which no teacher could do without the supports we give them. On our e-reader, if you click on a word that you don't know, that becomes part of your personalized vocabulary list. So you may not know diligent, I may not know extraordinary, but there's no teacher who's going to remember what all the different kids know and don't. And once you click on that, you then get driven, and research shows this will do it, 6 to 8 usages of that word in little videos, YouTube, little questions that and then when you use it on your e-writer, you get extra points. Now you can orchestrate the world that way. Same thing with the tool we created for teacher feedback. Everybody knows the more feedback timed at the right time will get kids to read more and might write more. And so we've now given the teacher tools. She can look on one page, see what feedback she's given, when the last time, how it affected the kid, when she needs to follow up. I mean, these are things that technology can bring to the classroom that makes it so much easier for teaching. On the other hand, there are things technology can bring for the classroom that get kids much more engaged. We have a book. It's a very hard book for young kids to read about the life of Frederick Douglass, the slave. And we found by using Chadwick Boseman, the guy who starred in 42, the Jackie Robinson, using him to read the first chapter, just in street clothes, gets kids so much more engaged in what's going on. And it's that process, get teachers empowered, get kids engaged. If technology does that, we're onto something huge.
I mean, I can imagine, though, that Apple doesn't like that. I mean, you know, the iPad is something that so many people sort of tout as being this future of education.
It's a great product. It's a great product.
But what you're saying is you need a more customized product.
Well, I think in the end, schools will decide this. I mean, lots of schools will like the iPad and so forth. But my view is everything has to be seen through the lens of teaching and learning. If it doesn't improve that intersection, it may be fun, it may be cool, kids may like it because they can get on the internet, but what I'm really focused on, and we at Amplify care about, is the teaching-learning interface.
Let's talk about personalization and customization, because that's something that, you know, is very ingrained in the curriculum at AltSchool, and something that you pioneered a little bit at School of One. So, you know, Max, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you guys are approaching that, and where does that end?
So one of the things that I wasn't expecting in working on a startup in the education space is that we would actually be kind of pushing the envelope in the broader technology sphere. I'd kind of assumed that we would take the things that we know to work in broader consumer and enterprise and kind of bring it to bear on education, and that would be most of the kind of technical value that we could do. And I'd say the place where we're pushing the envelope the most is around this notion of personalization first. And you see bits of it crop up elsewhere, so around personalized medicine and the idea that we're going to move away from these kind of large-scale clinical trials to every person getting exactly the kind of treatment that's best for them, given a very particular profile that they have. And so, you know, we're kind of reinventing what it means to do research in an arena where it's personalization first, where actually at the end of an elementary school decade, what one child went through is totally different than what every other child went through. What that requires is first and foremost to understand the child, to really describe them in an actionable, structured way. And that for us, we call it a learner profile, and it comprises the interest of that child, the level they've achieved across different kind of standards-based academic and non-academic trajectories. It includes their kind of home context, everything that would be useful to you as an educator to individualize your instruction.
That sounds really time intensive.
It's extremely time intensive without a kind of methodology and without tools in order to do it. And it's not as if you do it perfectly. When a student comes in, you do it at kind of a first pass level, but every year that the student's in your system, it becomes richer and richer. So that's the kind of first phase. The next phase is to actually plan for that student and map from the global goals and milestones that we would expect any child to want to hit during their school for that particular child, given their learner profile. And then the last phase is the actual kind of week-to-week experience, which manifests itself in kind of 15 to 20 projects and activities that they're doing, sometimes in a group, sometimes by themselves, sometimes with the teacher. And so that kind of cycle, as you do it over and over again, is the actual way that we personalize. So what you end up with is, from the understanding of every student, to get to what generally we would agree students should learn, but in a totally unique, individualized way.
What do you think about personalization? I mean, how did you think about it with School of One, and what went right and what went wrong?
So first of all, we're really in the earliest innings, Leena, on personalization. And you're right that this will be challenging. But the alternative is wholly dysfunctional. You know how many classrooms I walked into where I'd see a teacher have some kids 2 years behind, some kids a year ahead. She's trying to find the sweet spot all by herself. I mean, if a kid knows fractions and another kid doesn't know decimals, there's no point teaching the kid fractions again, and there's no point not teaching the kid decimals who needs to know decimals. We can do this, and School of One did it. Now, over time, what you need is more and more sophisticated knowledge about the kid. You've got to have at least this much standardization so that you know that they're mastering the skills necessary. That's why I've always been a big fan of Common Core standards, and so that we can measure in the end how well people are matching up. But we are going to see a system much more move to competency and personalization. I'll never forget, I walked to the School of One on January 14th several years ago, and I walked up, it was an 8th grade math grouping, and I walked up to a kid and I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm so glad you called on me. He said, I just started 9th grade. I said, what do you mean 9th grade? This is 8th grade. He said, no, I finished 8th grade on January 14th. I'm now doing 9th grade. I said, what happened to you last year? He said, last year, he said, I got so bored, I got in trouble. And in that little story tells you something about the promise and the future of personalization. And again, there's no reason we can't do this. Feed kids more of what they want at the levels they're ready to play and keep them much more engaged in the process.
How far are we though? You know, I have a 2-year-old daughter. I mean, if she
It'll
goes
be
to
there for her.
If she does,
I'm going to get it done for her.
If she goes to public school, I mean, not, you know,
not to all.
Not alt school. But I would like her one day maybe to go to alt school. But, you know, if she's in public school, you know, in New York or San Francisco or in Ohio, like how far are we from it?
Look, I think the next 2 or 3 years we'll see significant growth and expansion. And 5 to 7 years, it'll look very, very different. Now, by the standards of the Valley, that seems forever in a sense. By the standards of the school system, you're talking about accelerated change. Just think about this. You know, the classroom in the 19th century is no different from the classroom basically today.
That's a point that Max
it's just extraordinary. Think about in the 18th century in America, textbooks were the model. Now we're at the point where textbooks are going to be yesterday and replaced by something that's going to bring to life an animated curriculum, personalized, much more dynamic, much more group work. We have a quest that kids work on together. And I've been to schools recently in New Orleans and elsewhere where kids are working on these things. It's a very different engagement. And if you have any doubt about it, just ask the kids who are excited about it. When I see kids sneaking in a room to read more of Edgar Allan Poe, I think it's pretty cool stuff, right? And so, you know, for somebody who spent almost 9 years in the New York City public schools, the level and the pace of change now excites me so much. And to see people like Max, who really are just basically making their career bringing the intelligence that he's bringing, the knowledge of technology, and translating it into the teaching and learning space. I think it's so powerful, and you can see more of it.
Well, what I find really interesting about you, Max, is you're a technologist and didn't have any background in education, but just decided, were inspired to really go after this huge market. When you first pitched, you know, VCs, you just raised a big round, $33 million of funding from Founders Fund and Andreessen. But when you first pitched VCs on this idea, so take me back to like maybe 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, what was the reaction? I mean, were they kind of in disbelief?
So first off, it was less than a year ago. We started the company in June of 2013. The first thing we did was actually open a school. So in 2 months, we kind of figured out how you could push something through very quickly from a permitting standpoint, and we had a classroom up and running, and that's essential for entering a new space. You need to do it in a user-driven way. You need to learn by doing. Moreover, our whole strategy is about making schools evolve. You started with this question of change. Everything we do is about how do we make a school system get better as it increases in size, and how do we make a school system get better as more time goes on. And it's one of the reasons why when I'm asked kind of why do you think your model is better, I say, well, it's not about our model. We have a real benefit in coming after all these other great models like Rocket Ship and School of One and you know, individual, amazing, personalized schools. But at the core, we're just kind of saying, let's bring more and more students and teachers and parents into the fold, and over time, this will get better and better at an accelerating rate if we use technology in the right way, if we kind of create a culture and a structure for change. And that was ultimately something that, given the enormous size of the market, given the enormous importance of the market, and the fact that, you know, ultimately, venture capitalists, just like entrepreneurs, are aspirational. They want to feel like, because they're doing this, the world is a better place, the world is a different place. And so it very much appealed to funders when we actually went out and raised, you know, our kind of big A round. We started out just raising money from the people that had already invested in us before. And I mean, in some senses, they were investing in spite of the fact that we were working on education. I think a lot of them felt like, couldn't you just, you know, do another social mobile geo payment startup, and I get that. But there was also, Harrison Metal and First Round Capital that led our seed round, I think likewise felt that this was the kind of thing that they wanted to be a part of because it would really matter if it worked. And there's something that you can't beat in kind of a mission-driven startup, which is very different than the kind of technologies I've worked on before.
What he said is so profound because he's in the classroom, right? I mean, he's not sitting in a lab somewhere or trying to develop an app. He's in the school building. I mean, the strength that I've always thought Amplify has is the fact that our people really grew up in the education space. I mean, starting with the almost decade I spent in New York, thinking about how do you use what's out there to improve this interface of teaching and learning. And everything we do, we develop with kids, with teachers. We constantly change product because nobody, no matter how smart you are, is going to figure out the perfect app in some sort of friction-free environment. And so the constant adaptation is so critical, and that's exactly what they're doing.
And I'm also a believer, and this was a lot of kind of looking at School of One and even the work that Amplify was doing early on, and in kind of more ambitious, more holistic approaches. As I said before, I think it's very, very hard to kind of incrementally change schools, to lob in this little piece or change this little aspect. I think that ultimately you need a kind of full stack
You have to go for
approach.
the shot.
Well, part of it, you got to realize, at least our whole approach is what we call teacher-centric. I'm not putting kids in front of a screen and say, have a good life. There's a world for MOOCs. We have a MOOC for advanced placement computer science. But I am basically building off a teacher-orchestrated model. Teacher only has so many hours in a day. If you try to shove a fire hose in her mouth and ask her to take a sip, it's not going to work. And so thinking about it in terms of the human capital on the ground, how you get them working together, learning from each other, but also how they feel empowered, not overwhelmed. And that's a mission-critical consideration.
Would Amplify ever open schools? I mean, is that something that you've ever talked about?
It's not something, it's something that we would partner with people, but right now it's not on our immediate roadmap. But remember, Amplify has got a decade of people who have lived inside the DNA of the schools. So many on our team, including guys like Pete Gorman, who's former chancellor or superintendent out of Charlotte-Mecklenburg. This is their lives. And what I've always said, we're the education company that best knows technology and the tech company that best knows education.
What does success look like for you?
So quickly, I mean, we look at 4 different buckets. One is, as Joel mentioned, I think most importantly, just standards-based academic and non-academic progress. Are the kids kind of learning in an objective, measurable way? Second is satisfaction. Do kids love going to school? Do parents want to keep sending their kids to that school? Do teachers recruit, their friends from the teaching profession and say, this is where you want to teach? Third, we look at the business measures. Are we growing? Are we providing a higher quality product for less and less money, not more and more money? And then finally, we actually directly measure how fast we're evolving. So we look at, how successful are we at introducing changes? How successful are we at course correcting when things aren't working? How successful are we at kind of, magnifying the scope of all the classrooms that are doing that thing which we've shown to be better for that kind of student? And across